So I think I'll start by welcoming everyone. I'm Ruth Bretherick, Research and Public Engagement Curator at the Fruitmarket, and I'm zooming in from the actual Fruitmarket tonight. The rest of our panellists are at home, even though some of them have backgrounds that make them look like they're here. And thank you so much for all joining us at this event about creative, architectural and public space and the work of Karla Black. Well, I'm sure many of you will have visited the exhibition at the Fruitmarket. We're going to start by viewing a short exhibition walkthrough, which is about 6 minutes long. And while this is playing, please feel free to introduce yourself on the chat if you'd like to, and tell us where you're tuning in from. You can also tell us whether you've seen the exhibition or not, and that will give us a little idea of who we're talking to. So I will start the exhibition walkthrough. Hopefully you can all see the exhibition walkthrough that we made of this exhibition, which we haven't done before, but we did during these COVID times, so that people who weren't able to come and see the exhibition in person were able to view it. So this is the lower gallery, and the walkthrough has wide pans as well as close-ups to give you a sense of what it might be like to view the exhibition in person. Oh, hang on. Sorry. This exhibition walkthrough was made near the beginning of the exhibition, and actually some of these works have changed during the time of the exhibition. So you're currently seeing a work called Better, well, it's gone now, but which is made out of Gaviscon poured onto the floor, and it now is completely all dried up and crackled in the middle as well. So this film is also a recording of the kind of timeline of these works and how they've changed. So this is the upper gallery that you're viewing now. This is a work called Punctuation is Pretty Popular. Nobody wants to admit to much. And it's made out of plaster powder, covering the entire floor of the upper gallery. It's really difficult to capture on film. I think it's one of those works that experiencing in person has a real wow factor to it, even though that's a kind of slightly horrible terminology to use. So if anyone's joined in between the beginning and now, I'll ask people to introduce themselves on the chat if they'd like to, and say where you're tuning in from. Fiona Bradley, our director, is manning the chat, so we'll reply to you. So for those of you who haven't been, this is the new warehouse space, which is the extension of the Fruitmarket and has quite a different character to the pre-existing Fruitmarket building, which I'm sure we will talk about. Right, I'm going to stop sharing that screen now. And welcome again. So if anyone's joined us in that time, we were just watching an exhibition walkthrough of the Karla Black exhibition. Hopefully a refresher for those of you who have seen the exhibition, and for those who haven't, just a little glimpse into what it might be like to see it in person. This event is about space, gallery space, exhibition space, creative space, architectural space, public space. And in a way, it's really strange to be holding this event online because it's about physical space and the way in which art works in space and makes space for us. I'm also, in a way, really pleased that we're still doing this. We're doing this at a point when we're still emerging from private and online space into public space, since it makes the topic all the more potent. We're at a point of remembering not to take for granted that the special pull of being in real space with physical art objects. And I hope we'll look at this a bit this evening, which I think we will. I'm really happy to welcome Kamini Vellodi, Dominic Paterson and Stephanie Straine to take part in this discussion. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the invitation that I put to them when I asked them all to take part. Then each of them in turn will talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. Then we'll come together for a discussion and Q&A for half an hour or so. So if you've got any questions for the speakers, please type them into the Q&A and we'll come to them during the discussion at the end. I'll introduce each speaker before they speak as well. So the title for this panel discussion is This Little Fenced Off Space, which comes from the film that was made to accompany this exhibition. And in the film, Karla Black says, "We as artists are given this permission and this little fenced off space that has this label on it that's called art, where we are allowed and given permission to behave like the animals we are. If I was to do that out in the street, what I did in here, just scrabble about in the dirt, there would be a different response to that. And that's just to do with what you call it, where it happens, where it's allowed, and how it's fenced off." So the invitation I put to the speakers drew upon these ideas. In particular, I was and am keen to take the discussion around Karla Black's work beyond the usual writing about materials, medium, and abstraction, which are the hermetic concerns of art and art practice. What the quotation I just read implies is that Karla's work is also concerned with the art world, the space created by the structures around art, the galleries, the museums, the art market, and what these spaces do or don't do to affect or trouble the kind of work that Karla or any artist can make. There's also a relationship between these spaces and the wider world. How are we expected to behave in each of them as civilized people? And does this make the work political? I was also interested in the space that Karla's sculptures take up, they can both be self-contained and also spread into the architectural spaces they occupy, which I hope you got a sense of in the film we just looked at. Yet at the same time, Karla also talks about making space for people with her work, how abstraction leaves gaps that let you in, where, as she says, you can see an agile mind at work and get yourself involved. So I ask all the speakers to respond to these ideas and also think about them in the light of the reopening of the Fruitmarket as a public space at a time when our relationship with public spaces and those who occupy them is so fraught as we emerge from the pandemic. Starved not only of contact with other people, but also of the materiality that art can offer, we have found ourselves craving these things in the last 18 months or so. Being in a space with Karla's work really fulfills this need. So I'd like to invite Stephanie to speak first.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I'm just going to share my screen now, hopefully. Thanks to Ruth and the Fruitmarket for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's really wonderful. I'm just checking you can see my title page. Is that okay? Brilliant, thanks. So I also took inspiration from the exhibition film with my title. Group Material was a New York-based artist collective operating in the 80s and 90s. One of its members, Doug Ashford, wrote in a 1997 art syllabus about the radical possibilities that artists present when they actively reorganize institutional traditions. I think that this work of reorganization can be applied to the practice of Karla Black, particularly when we view her work through the lens of space in all its complexities and porous boundaries between what is public and what is private. I admit that it might seem strange to invoke an artist collective in relation to another artist who is well known to make her work alone. While it's true that Group Material were working in a context vastly different to Black's, with different aims, intentions, and methods, I feel they nonetheless share an interest in challenging what is assumed to be static and unyielding in the continuation of traditions, expectations, and behaviors as they pertain to the museum or gallery space, a peculiar public arena that is apparently liberated from conventions, but ultimately determined by them. Ashford's syllabus was partly published in an article the following year, in 1998, in Art Journal, under the title, The Exhibition as Artistic Medium. While I'm not claiming that Black is an installation artist, a term with a lot of historical and conceptual baggage, let's say, I would suggest that through her sculpture, she approaches this very condition of the exhibition as medium, which is to say, her practice is aware of and concerned with our experience of the space in its entirety, as a visitor to and occupier of her work. The field of her sculpture is the field of the exhibition space. I want to think about how Black might be operating within, or possibly even undermining, that idea of the exhibition as medium. In this particular exhibition, the artist gives us a plurality of spaces, one that is occupied by a single work in the upper gallery, one that a new commission responds to, bringing together a large floor-based work and smaller wall-based works in the new warehouse space, and a third, sorry, that jumped ahead, and a third space that operates as both retrospective and fragmentation, which is the lower gallery, the first space you actually see upon entering the building. What then do we, the visitors, her audience, bring to this public space when the work has been determined by a solitary and private act of making? We bring our actions and our reactions. We could say that a space of permission has been granted to us, the audience. However, it's not permission to change anything, nor to alter the space and sculpture as it has been left by the artist. Rather, it's permission to build our own response to what we encounter and experience, without a trail of breadcrumbs being left for us. It's more like a subtle process of accretion, of constructing our take on what and where we find ourselves in, which is to say, a space without wayfinding, a space given over to a threshold where our bodies meet another kind of presence. We might understand more carefully what our own relationship is to artistic process in this moment of careful negotiation. You, as the viewer, are asked to undertake this negotiation between the boundaries of your body and the world of this work. You're asked to be a good temporary neighbour to these sculptures. You're directed to the peripheries of these spaces. You walk along the edge of the upper gallery, carefully making sure not to step on the pink powder, not to besmirch its surface with any evidence of contact or intrusion. It's an exercise in spatial awareness. This work in the upper gallery catches your attention from above in the most subtly confusing of ways. A few threads announce themselves on your approach, dangling down into the stairwell and trailing onto the handrail, catching your hand as you move upwards towards the pink-hued light. We follow the thread of this work. Something that starts out as an overlooked, minor intrusion in a circulation space, a stairwell, something that seems almost like an accidental leftover, a sliver of matter out of place, becomes a space-filling, vast horizontal ground and field. Seen from the vantage point at the top of the stairs, when we turn around to face this field, those errant threads from the coloured spools become a way to produce the gestures, marks, and notations on the blank sheet of paper. The ground of the work is really the ground of drawing. We're on the edge of the soft powdery field at the very edge of abstraction itself. Meaning is not imposed, so what's left? Where are we without meaning? It can be an unnerving and uncomfortable place to sit for many people. You're asked instead to really sit with these sculptures' abstract qualities and quantities, not to inscribe them with meaning or explanations. But why does this term abstract still arouse such wariness, such aversion amongst many? Karla Black is definite in her terms. She's not telling us a story with her sculptures. There's no narrative to uncover here and no key to unlocking the meaning that some might seek. That being said, I think we can never fully let go of the baggage we bring to these sculptures. That baggage is our memories, sensations, our physical and tactile knowledge. We all have links to these materials and even their treatments here, like the knowledge of their sounds they make when being handled, squeaky, crinkly, crunchy, or their textures, viscosity or crumbliness. We have these memories without the interaction. Instead of stories from the artist, we have space. Space where the artist's body once was and where we now stand. A transition from private to public, from one person to many. Despite the sculpture's often temporary nature, the passage of time still shapes the spaces of Black's practice. What she chooses to show us might be brand new, the necessary materials ordered and the appropriate quantities for these spaces. But the sculptures have soaked up the time of looking and thinking that their earlier studio proxies have been subjected to. Waver for shade in the warehouse feels ritualistic, almost foreboding. We enter this dark space with its charged energy of a nighttime space, and we register the stacks of soil, the rectilinear templates made of soil, and the gold and copper leaf that lines the floor and mounds of brown earth. The sculpture dominates the space and we make our allowances for it. And yet it's also subsumed by the space, swallowed up by it. For us, it becomes a space of heightened awareness, of being aware how close we are to parts and aspects of the work at any one time, to a material that has been applied or positioned by the artist on brick walls or on the black timber shutters, something that might transfer some of its residue onto us should we encroach upon its space. We won't remain unmarked by that encounter. The equivalence of body to space is one-to-one, in that all the material efforts and actions are determined by the artist's reach or throw, working alone. Physical limits become architectural limits. As Black declares, It's just me and the space. When we think about one of the phrases that's framed this discussion tonight, making space with art, it's suggestive of a two-way process, of some push and pull, some give and take. It also hints at the actual artistic labor and production, the making which remains unseen to our eyes, but the gestures from which leave a roadmap for us to imagine that labor. Making space with art holds a mirror up to how the artist herself talks about her practice. Making space with art rather than making a space for art is a reminder that we are, in this encounter, holding the space together. As the artist said in an interview in 2010, I want the process to be so open that they know they could physically change the shape of the work or make a mark in it. Because they're not allowed to touch the work, what would be a physical response must then divert into a cerebral, optical one. I wanted the person present in the finished work to be the person looking at it. I'm drawn here to Black's choice of the word divert. It's most commonly used in spatial contexts, of course, like a diversion on a route we're traveling. To divert a response is to affect change on a bodily level for those entering her work. And this is a process only possible because the artist's control over these spaces of display. In the exhibition film, the artist also states, the upper gallery is a recreation of a pink powder work I first made in London in 2008, and it is in no way the same. This invocation of repetition and difference over a lengthy span of time between one work and the other is crucial, I think, in distinguishing her exhibition-making practice from a means of reiteration and redisplay. Julie Alt, another former member of Group Material, puts it this way: contexts cannot be replicated. Black insists that this work upstairs at Fruitmarket is both a recreation of and dissimilar to the 2008 version. If we hold these both to be true, then what emerges as the dominant factor is the space in either context. Very few people will have seen both works in person, but it's far more possible to have seen images of both works. Art historian Christine Mehring, in a recent article, noted that conventionally the work is what leaves the studio. Conservator Christian Scheidemann has proposed that the first official photograph of an artwork in, say, an exhibition catalogue as the defining boundary. So this is a boundary line or marker. Again, we're thinking in terms of spaces, what delineates them, and the temporality that conditions all of our understanding of space. Like many artists, Black very carefully understands the role of installation photography in the dissemination of her practice. In fact, she herself has taken most of the images of her exhibition, mainly extreme close-up, near disorienting details that are published in its accompanying catalogue, alongside these installation photographs by Tom Nolan that I'm using here. It is this act of documentation more than anything else which bestows permanence and circulation upon an artwork, regardless of its materials. With this, we return to the terrain of exhibition as medium. Black's work is not always made in the studio. It might be tested or trialed out there, but not fully realized. So in effect, she uses public space as a place of making or of finishing that making. Rather than simply exhibiting and moving static finished works from studio to gallery, her materials are brought to the gallery, and it is in that space that the work is made. And yet they're not always site-specific. Works migrate and are remade in different places. But there is that first invitation to a space, that offer to make something for a specific public building. That's often how the artist's solo exhibitions are generated. The details for a retrospective that we encounter in the lower gallery almost entirely unmakes that premise. In the lower gallery, we have, instead of exhibition as medium, exhibition as material inventory, as catalogue raisonné, as an archive without stand-ins, an archive that's been reanimated, reconstituted in 3 dimensions. The exhibition notes state that it is filled with sculptures from throughout the artist's career, and that couldn't be truer. Perilously busy with works jostling for space. Sculptures have been transported to the lower gallery from private collections in London, Munich and Cologne, and from other types of spaces like storage facilities. Some of these sculptures are shown in this room in Edinburgh for the first time, having been first exhibited in the artist's solo show for the Venice Biennale a decade earlier, also organised by Fruitmarket. Black explains in the exhibition film that this is the space for all the more solid work, the sculptures that can stand up by themselves or that can hang. And it's a much more traditional layout, and that's really intentional to put all of those in one room. The layout reminds me of Claes Oldenburg's The Store. This is an image from its 1963 iteration at Green Gallery. The Store showcased a freestanding or free-hanging array of sculptures that were also identifiable as consumable or commercial goods of a perishable nature. The same can be said of the commercial, consumable, and indeed perishable nature of the materials used by Black. Perhaps we can start to think about our relationship to Black spaces in terms akin to this transformation of the everyday. And I'm also showing you here an image from the solo exhibition that preceded Fruitmarket at the Des Moines Center in Iowa last year, where the artist was invited to show her works alongside works from their permanent collection. And she chose Claes Oldenburg's 3-way plug as one of the artworks. I couldn't find an installation image, so I'm using their virtual exhibition scan, which I think is quite appropriate given our Zoom context tonight. So how do we negotiate the lower gallery? Did it not make us a little nervous? The close huddle of these works, the sense of filling the space to sheer abundance, especially when compared to the powdery emptiness of upstairs directly above. Did we forget how to behave? Did our time away from museums and galleries leave us with a sense of uncertainty or even stress and worry in this space? Black describes this as a more traditional gallery layout, which it is to some extent, but I feel it also pushes against that to a point of instability. Hanging sculptures break the line of sight towards floor-based ones. We peer through transparent sculptures, seeing not only their painted glass or cellophane surfaces, but the chalk, plaster, or powder ones beyond them. I used the word fragmentation earlier to describe this space, deliberately to undermine the inference of cohesive overview that the phrase retrospective in this context implies. Black has taken all of her most solid works and brought that solidity to a point where it might shatter or break, not simply by virtue of material precarity, but thanks to the heightened behaviors that are imposed upon us in this space. Huddled and humming together, they dramatize the bodily tension that arises from treating the exhibition space in this way, where you're able to get tantalizingly, dangerously close, yet must hold yourself at one remove. My impression is that Black was keen to cultivate this tension in Details for a Retrospective between the new warehouse commission of visceral energy, the airy upper gallery, and the tightly packed downstairs room of past works. She said in a recent interview, "I want the conditions of the studio, but I want them in the institution, which is ridiculous." This act of spatial sleight of hand, while affirmed by her as an impossibility of sorts, gives rise, I feel, to a state of bodily abstraction for her viewers, as much as for the sculptures themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I realised in my haste that I forgot to introduce Stephanie, and I have a wonderful biography of her, so I'm going to do it at the end, even though that's not right. But anyway, I don't want to miss out, so I'm going to read it now. Dr. Stephanie Straine is Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Galleries of Scotland, where she has recently worked in a partnership with Edinburgh Art Festival to present Isaac Julian Lessons of the Hour on view at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, Modern One, until the 10th of October. So you can still catch that. She's previously worked in exhibitions curating at Modern Art Oxford, Tate Liverpool, and the Fruitmarket. She publishes widely on modern and contemporary art with a focus on artists working with drawing, and sits on the board of David Dale Gallery and Studios. She has recently published a book on abstract art with Thames and Hudson as part of their Art Essentials series 2020. And I just want to thank you for that beautiful talk, Stephanie. I drew out so many phrases that you, ways of describing the encounter with the work. I think you're fantastic at describing what it is like as a viewer to jostle with the work in space, and that kind of way you have to be nimble around it. And we'll pick up on some of that when we come together at the end. But I particularly liked your phrase, being a good temporary neighbour to these sculptures. I think that I feel like that right now. I'm really close to some of these works, and trying to be a good temporary neighbour. So I'm going to pass over to Dominic now, and I will introduce him before rather than afterwards, because I think that was slightly unusual. So Dr. Dominic Patterson is Senior Lecturer in History of Art and Curator of Contemporary Art at the Hunterian University of Glasgow. His research interests focus on the issues of appropriation and temporality within contemporary artistic practice, and on the legacies of critical theory, especially the work of Michel Foucault. Dr. Patterson has written art criticism for Map magazine, the Burlington and Burlington Contemporary, among others, and was a contributor to Edinburgh University Press's Dictionary of Modernism in 2018. Recent publications include The Generous Landscape, 10 Years of Jupiter Artland, 2019, and Fellow Traveller, 2021, a monograph on the artist Neil Clements. As a curator, he has worked with artists such as Ilana Halprin, Alex Impey, Ulrike Ottinger, and Jimmy Robert on solo exhibitions. So I'm going to pass over to Dominic now to introduce his talk, Hang-Ups and Put-Downs on Karla Black's Position Taking. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much to the Fruitmarket for the opportunity to speak about this fascinating show, about Karla's compelling practice and this intriguing theme, and particular thanks to Ruth for her careful preparation of the event. I'll dive right into what I have to say. In his recent review of this exhibition for Frieze, Tom Jeffries pointed to two contradictions that he perceived in Karla Black's work. One concerned making and meaning. As he put it, quote, on the one hand, there's the artist's defiant rejection of contemporary art's tendency towards exegesis in favour of an emphasis on childlike, pre-linguistic, material playfulness, end quote. These are the Kleinian dimensions of Karla Black's practice, in other words. And this Jeffries found to be in tension with what he calls, quote, a desire to control how the work is presented, maintained, and received by audiences, end quote. He was also bothered by a perceived dichotomy between the performed making of the work and its suspended state of aftermath, at least for the viewer. And one of the things at stake here, clearly, is the category of the retrospective itself, as it struggles to describe, frame, or organize a body of work that has always insisted on its making, its becoming, its material intransigence in the face of museological tidiness, an oeuvre that has insisted emphatically on existing in a contingent present tense. But Karla Black has always insisted too that her work should be treated as sculpture proper, with all that entails. Contradictory, perhaps, but her occupation, or her carving out of a space between the emergent, materializing, and protean character of her sculpture and its life within the spaces, physical and discursive, provided by the art world, including the very category of sculpture, is a feat in itself, I think. Staying within the seeming contradictions here is a way of claiming a certain space within the context of art that is Karla's own. As she reinstalls her works in gallery or museum contexts, this carved out space inscribes or transposes itself onto the physical spaces, the walls and floors of particular art institutions. The sculptures at the Fruitmarket may inhabit a retrospective, but reciprocally, this retrospective and this space is recast and reframed. Works from Black's past productions seize hold of space, not least in the upper gallery, where, as we've seen, punctuation is pretty popular. Nobody wants to admit to much, declares its possession of the gallery in bold, incandescent terms. I will be returning to the question of position taking and of seeming paradox or contradiction in details for a retrospective at the end of my talk, bringing us back, I hope, to what confronts us in this exhibition in the present moment. But my remarks here will be restricted to a retrospective key for the most part. Thinking about Karla's work in retrospect has brought me back to what I recollect as my first encounter with her art. In 2005, the late and much missed John Calcutt curated an exhibition for the CCA in Glasgow entitled Like It Matters. It featured work by 3 former students of Glasgow School of Art's MFA programme, which John then led. These 3 were Mick Peter, Michael Stumpf and Karla Black. Interspersed among the works the trio showed in Like It Matters were video projections showing filmed performances by icons of the 1960s and 70s, Bastianada, Bruce Nauman, Robert Rauschenberg, and Karla Schneemann. As an art history student, I came to these videos with no little sense of awe. In 2005, it was still an event, with a capital E, to see even low-resolution versions of these canonical works. Despite their near inaccessibility, they were certainly already established as foundational to the opening out, or some might say breaking down, of traditional mediums and the contagion of painting, drawing, and sculpture by forms of event, choreography, music, technology, and performativity in all its guises. In Like It Matters, Bastianada teetered in imitation of a Mondrian abstraction with its stark horizontals, verticals, and diagonals. Karla Schneemann swung over and among canvases that stretched across wall and floor. Naumann paced his studio like an automaton. Rauschenberg capered on roller skates in his famous piece Pelican, a parachute on his back as if to make clear that any fall to earth that this high-flying artist would make would be anything but Icarian. In all the works, indeed, there was a reaching for a state of groundedness, and one that was contingent above all on mobilizing the artist's own body within the work. The juxtaposition with the work of the 3 young Glasgow-based and certainly yet to be canonical artists was a bravura move on John's part, but it did seem to suggest a plausible genealogy for what they were doing. And this was especially true, I remember thinking, of Karla Black. Her work, if memory serves, and the internet's supposedly total recall has not confirmed it in this case, spilled across a substantial part of the gallery's walls and floor, and seemed to consciously redeploy the scatter logic of the late 1960s, using materials derived from the quotidian and low-status materiality of consumer goods. It was obviously the work of a savvy, ambitious artist. If Eva Hesse could learn from Las Vegas, or some such glib formulation crossed my mind in immediate response, I was writing art reviews at the time, and that was pretty much the level I was operating at, I'm ashamed to say. I do remember the work was entirely convincing to me, and that, against some resistance on my part, it made good on John Calcutt's gambit of putting it into direct comparison with the iconic experiments of that earlier era. And one reason for this, I think, is that the work picked up on a key formal and phenomenological preoccupation of that period, namely the spatial and perceptual relationships between vertical and horizontal planes, more prosaically between walls and floors. To briefly rehearse some well-documented moments of this history, we might note Jackson Pollock making paintings on the floor, being photographed and filmed doing so, being pulled up into propriety and modernist purity by a critical apparatus that reduced his material practice to a hallucinated visuality, amenable, or so it was said, to eyesight alone. Artists working after Pollock, but alienated from that modernist criticism, pulled in the other direction, back to the work's relationship to gravity, materiality, embodiment, and making. In Rosalind Krauss's brilliant reading of this turn, elaborated in books such as The Optical Unconscious and Formless, A User's Guide, we learn that Pollock, quote, was the first to underscore the horizontality of the support as the essential element of his work process, end quote. And, to quote again, that Pollock delegated a part of his process to matter itself. On Krauss's account, works such as Andy Warhol's dance diagrams echoed and parodied Pollock stepping into his own works in progress, automating, mechanizing, and subverting this gesture for artist and viewer alike. His oxidation paintings, meanwhile, decode the Pollockian drip technique as a kind of pissing contest. They're literally made with urine, as you can see on copper. Cy Twombly's paintings for Krauss scratched out a libidinal and specifically homoerotic indexical mark-making, wherein Pollock's free-flowing lines are recast as so much graffiti. Robert Morris's thread waste and felt pieces succumb to gravity and, unlike Pollock's paintings, resist any final fixity. And Richard Serra's splashed lead across junctions of wall and floor, his props and their reliance on, as well as defiance of gravity, made process palpably part of the final work. In all these instances, modernist hang-ups about opticality and medium specificity are subject to lowering, to a taking down, that brings them back to something originary, basic, and grounded. For Krauss, this could also be read as an impulse towards what the philosopher Georges Bataille characterized as baseness, through his ideas of the informe, or formless, in which it is less the ground than the abyss that undergirds cultural forms. There is the risk, or perhaps the promise, in this formulation of falling below culture altogether. The trajectory of Paul McCarthy's early work, which lowers the artist into a position of functioning as the tool within his own work, which makes paint into a lubricant or slime, and which swaps canvas for concrete floor, points us in that direction. And finally, we can see alongside these rereadings of Pollock's horizontality, the rethinking of painting, in which we see a new direction in sculpture, with the displacement of minimalism's seriality, its seriousness, and its industrial surfaces, as they yield to the subjective, formless, and sensuous object world of eccentric abstraction, as Lucy Lippard termed it in an exhibition of 1966. Here, tactility, desire, and bodily sensation become, if not reference, at least resonances of the work, and the slippages between painting and sculpture, between wall and floor, become more pronounced still. Of all the artists mentioned so far, it was Morris, a PhD graduate and a noted position taker, who chose to formulate a written argument in favor of horizontality and what he would term the retention of phenomenology of making in what might otherwise be expected to count as a finished artwork. In setting out his stall in favor of an art that would, like Pollock, quote, recover process and hold on to it as part of the end form of the work, end quote, he gave particular importance to the perceptual character of scattered objects in the horizontal plane. Drawing on the work of the Austrian-born, London-based psychologist Anton Ehrenzweig, a man deeply influenced, as is Karla Black, by Melanie Klein, Morris argued for the value of an unmappable, ungraspable material encounter with formless matter. If painting and verticality and the wall are the spaces of face-to-face encounter, of facingness and reciprocal recognition, of finished works and of proper art, Ehrenzweig limned the scattering of attention on a de-differentiated ground, as opposed to on a delineated figure, in an unfocused but productive scanning. This kind of dreamy inattention underpinned, in his view, the creative process itself and the exploration or invention of new forms. Here we find the de-differentiated ground as latency, projection, the inchoate, the emergent. And it was in this space that Morris imagined he could identify a kind of lowered horizontal field for his own work. Nonetheless, Morris was bothered by what he saw as Ehrenzweig's binary take on differentiated and de-differentiated modes of artistic experience. In prose, at least, if not always in his art, Morris sought a more ambiguous flux between the two. This is perhaps the position that some of the most interesting works of the 1960s are seeking also. The ambivalence that Eva Hesse declared about her brilliant work, Hang Up, she is recorded as saying that it was extreme. I like it and I don't like it. Here it is in the studio, being liked and not liked, might flow from that spatial ambivalence and all that it suggests about mediums and different modalities of artistic existence. Naumann's endlessly uncomfortable wall-floor positions pinion the artist within the geometries of the studio and thence the gallery and the monitor. while Sam Gilliam's suspended exuberant canvases too suggest that not just putting down, lowering, but oscillating between putting down and hanging up could be a strategy for breaking the hold of fixed categories, fixed points of reference. Lauren Abscogarty has written that Gilliam's drape works reanimate post-war art history through the way they stage a tug of war between the optics of colour and the haptics of materiality. Neither side wins, but rather it seems the tug rope breaks only for those discrete modes of experiencing colour and material to collapse into one another, showing us that the correspondence between certain senses and those categories of looking and feeling were never really fixed. And in Karla Black's work, this tradition of breaking down and reanimating is very much felt, I think. In 2017, Karla spoke at a conference that I helped organise. Material Futures was part of an EU-funded initiative to train art conservators faced with the daunting material unruliness of contemporary artistic practice. Karla spoke with typical forthrightness and insight about the difficulties that museum practices imposed on her, and of her ongoing effort to cope with or reconcile the material character of her sculpture and the expectations that it should conform, behave well, and be compliant. To illustrate the difficult positions that these expectations could put her in, she told a story about working on an installation at a major museum. Watching the tentative efforts of the installation technicians to handle her work, Karla crawled under it to take charge of the operation. If I remember this anecdote correctly, it was at this point, entangled in her work, on all fours and covered in plaster dust, that Karla saw the museum director enter the gallery with some important guests. The point of the story was very much that this position, exemplary of an artistic mode of behaviour that both is and is not culturally acceptable within the spaces of art, was an unavoidable one. This caught in betweenness, being animalistic and refined, down low as a condition of being able to hang something up, was exactly where she felt she needed to be to make and to care for her sculpture. Barnett Newman once declared that he didn't manipulate or play with space, but declared it. Karla Black's declarations, like Eva Hesse's, are material, intangible, but they are also sometimes linguistic. Her titles, which are always excellent, would no doubt bear the same kind of careful scrutiny that Anne Wagner once dedicated to Hesse's titles, showing them to be fully part of her artistic creativity. And Karla's public discussion of her work, in which she doubles down on the hang-ups of institutions and on her own insistence on the work's non-symbolic materiality, are likewise deliberately and insistently reiterated as part of her practice. The contradictions deepen, of course, if we see it that way. It could indeed seem that in her discussion of the work, Black is attempting to have it both ways. I think this is even true of her work itself. But I also think that this occupation of a position that is at once cultural and bestial, linguistic and asymbolic, temporary and capable of being viewed in retrospect is an urgent and important one that Karla has defined for herself. And just in closing, I wanted to say that when I think of Karla's work, I often think less of Melanie Klein than of Donald Winnicott, who made the point that the difficult child was not the one that we needed to worry about or be bothered by, because they were ready to stand up for what they wanted. And it's her capacity to do that within her work and in relation to the rich art history of works that occupy the spaces of wall and floor with ambiguity and ambivalence that makes me really admire Karla Black's practice. And I will conclude there.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I really liked your art historical take on that, because I'm an art historian, so all of those images of things in the 60s were really great. And actually there was an event I ran last week about formlessness in Karla Black's work that drew out quite a lot of those threads as well. So it was great to see you bringing those to bear on it as well. I quite like the phrase scatter logic, because it was so close to scatological. But maybe we can talk about that a bit as well during the discussion at the end. Now I'm going to invite Kamini to speak, and if I can find her biography, I will introduce her. So Dr. Kamini Vellodi is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy, Theory and History of Art and Director of Research at Edinburgh College of Art, University of Edinburgh. Her research explores intersections between modern and contemporary continental philosophy, the philosophy, theory and historiography of art, history and the visual arts. She publishes widely on these topics, and her book, Tintoretto's Difference, Deleuze's Diagrammatics and Art History, was published by Bloomsbury in 2019. She is series editor for Refractions at the Borders of Art History and Philosophy, published by Edinburgh University Press. So I'll pass over to you, Kamini.
Many thanks, Ruth, for the invitation. It's really exciting to be part of this really timely and topical discussion on the nature of space and materiality in the current climate. Space is something we've no doubt all been thinking a lot about recently, the impact of quarantine, social isolation, and the temporary closure of public spaces on our experience of space, and how online saturation with its phenomena of digital placemaking and networked corporality have affected the ever mutable boundaries between private and public. There's been a great deal of debate too on the impact of such dynamics on art and cultural institutions and the culture and experience of exhibitions. Figures such as Tate's Francis Morris have stated that we will be necessarily speaking in terms of before and after. Some museum directors have said that after the pandemic, physical spaces can no longer be the priority, and the cultural sector will have to adapt to a digital-first audience. Others have stated that we will crave for a return to the physical, material, and tactile, to all those dimensions of bodily, communal, and apparently unmediated experience that have been suspended. So seen in this context, the reopening of the Fruitmarket is a compelling statement. The new warehouse space, with its openness and fractured interior, its numerous original exposed features, immediately prompts questions about the porosity of the gallery, its intersection with what lies outside it, with the city and the agency of architecture in placemaking and the experience of contemporary art. And this image shows the transformation of the gallery's facade since the 1970s to today, indicating the way the integration of inside and outside has changed at that time. Together with Black's work, to which the interaction between the physical world and material is so crucial, we're invited to reflect on how a life lived online and the screen fatigue of the past 2 years may have heightened our appreciation and need for physical spaces. In this regard, I find it really interesting that the Fruitmarket Gallery has resisted sort of the sways of digital information or mediated ways of experiencing the show online, encouraging us to visit in person and reminding us that even perhaps temporarily, the physical and network spaces can be prized apart. After the reliance on the visual flow of information through screens and the imposed restrictions on our physical mobility, we're invited to consider the value of moving through shared spaces with others. Something as simple as having to navigate our body in space to prevent colliding into an object or another person takes on a new potency. That is, one could say we have come to freshly appreciate the importance of place, that portion of space occupied by bodies. In this context, it is possible that gallery spaces may today be experienced even more intensely than before as gallery places. The contrast between the two types of space in which Karla Black's works are presented, the original white-walled galleries and the rough industrial interior of the new warehouse, prompts reflection on the physicality and materiality of space itself. We're reminded that space is not by no means a neutral container for the display of artworks, but an active component in our experience, a place to experience, as the art critic Rosalie Goldberg, writing in the 1970s, put it. In this sense, space is already placed, and in this case, we see it happening both through the architecture and through the artistic treatment of space. In terms of the architectural configuration of the revamped Fruitmarket, the relation of different and interconnected spaces within the site is important to note. The way we can move between the original gallery spaces through the coffee and bookshops, through a passageway into the new warehouse. This underscores the mixed social functions of the gallery spaces, that they're not just for the display of artworks, but activate different dimensions of collective social interaction and experience. In this sense, the revamp is notable not just for adding more space, but for impacting the nature of space through differentiating it. This agency of space is intensified by Black's practice, firstly an activation of space as material. Her works are to differing degrees site-specific in that their appearance and meaning is dependent on the space in which they're realized, and through their action in space, they convert it into a site. And we could also sort of refer to Douglas Crimp, the art historian Douglas Crimp's words here, speaking of minimalism, that if its site were to change, the minimalist object, so would the interrelationships of object, context, and viewer. On the ground floor, a family of objects are placed in relations with each other and with the architectural features of the room, hanging from ceilings, spread on floors, sitting close to walls and pillars, calling attention to the room's specific dimensions and features. Upstairs, Black has covered the floor with the pink powder plaster, a remade work first made in 2008. It also to fit each specific space in which it is shown and draws attention to its formal features. And here the boundary between the plaster and the wall is quite important, important feature. The new work was also made in situ and is a response to the space and its physical realities. As Black herself acknowledges, whilst most of the preparation of her work happens in the studio, she only finishes her works on site, and many, of course, are made in situ. And this process depends on the physical realities acting on the work and its process, its processual making, her own body, and the physical and material forces within the space. Whereas white walls place art, signaling what to expect, a warehouse space is perhaps not so overcoded in the nature of this placement. Although obviously now industrial spaces for the display of contemporary art are a firmly established tradition. Familiar examples here to all of you, I'm sure, the Tate Turbine Hall, the tanks below it, and the Baltic on the top right, and below it, the KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. The new Fruitmarket warehouse space then is operating in a context where space is less a guardian of objects than a living integration of space, architecture, and object. The new warehouse space brings emphasis to Black's work as installation art, as a key tenet that the interaction between site, work, and the viewer's body is primary to the experience of the work. Surely all exhibitions after lockdown bring attention to installation. We are freshly sensitized to this aspect of experience. After lockdown, there's undeniably something reassuring about the localization of objects and things and of experience itself to a particular non-substitutable space. Perhaps all exhibitions in the current climate do bring that kind of affirmation, but Black's work intensifies a sense of location through her treatment of material. Although Black is by no means unique in her treatment of material, and the art historical lineages in which she operates are well known and well established, and we've heard quite a bit about them from Stephanie and Dominic. And here, the post-minimalist practices of anti-form and process art, Richard Serra, Linda Benglis, Robert Smithson, Eva Hess, and more recently Wolfgang Leib. It's the meaning of those gestures and the encounter of such works in this current climate that's pertinent. That is, the question here is not the history, the revitalized history of art, but the contemporaneity of certain modalities of practice and their institutional presentation within collective lived experience. In her own words, Black wishes to create an absorbing material experience through, I quote, material abstraction, where abstraction signals that the materials are, quote, retarded in raw states of potential rather than worked up into static, permanent, or solid structures. And indeed, Black finds novel ways to extend the life of materials, creating plaster that never sets, paint that never dries, in turn emphasizing the impermanence of the object state and the fluidity between, for instance, painting and sculpture. Beyond its reciprocal and hylomorphic relation to form, material seeps into space and establishes a reciprocal and dynamizing relation to it. A diverse range of materials are retained on this abstract plane, art and non-art materials alike, all treated equally for their properties, for how they function, for the way they can conjure effects and sensations of opacity, translucency, viscosity, weightlessness, heaviness, and above all, retain a sense of the mutability of matter and the genesis of things, a continuum of materials freed from the classification, from any classification overdetermined by medium or signification. So whilst Black defends her work as sculpture, this is in a post-medium sense, of course. It's the event of material that blurs any distinction between plane and volume, confusing, moreover, any distinction between the object and its autonomy and sight. As Black says, sculpture is most interesting when it accepts the fact that the object is a fallacy, that material in this world is only ever flying together or flying apart. It is in this excess that material activates a dialogue with the given conditions of the gallery. Overspilling and unruly bits of thread hang off the girders and climb onto ledges. Blobs of Vaseline seep onto the exposed brick and window panes, once again affirming the building's new porosity and dynamic between inside and outside. Certainly, this confrontation is understated. Messiness is contained to the point of being decorative, and Black's own declared commitment to making things look good contains any anarchic or destabilizing potential. Nevertheless, there is an intervention whereby this seepage of material confuses rather than confirms the rationale of the space. Even though they are pretty, the gold foil sits awkwardly against the piles of earth, and within the industrial space, an insistent reminder of the corporeal. This matterism invites a particular kind of looking. It can be hard to take in everything at once and from a distance. The works are arranged in such a way that it's hard to orient oneself. One has to constantly move around and navigate to change direction and shift to avoid colliding with something. In addition, the excesses of material call us to approach ever closer. For instance, the way the pink powdery expanse is disrupted by these little bobbins of thread. In this way, space is decontextualized and becomes tactile, as if the eye were a hand moving over surfaces, losing a sense of the total optical form of the space that can be taken in all at once. It is this tactile experience of space that is heightened by the intermixing of the architectural spaces, their porosity and their permeability, that breaks the sense of space as containment whilst retaining the sensation of space as placement. Our own corporeal presence in the space is very much part of this differentiation. One might call it a co-creation. The slight movement of the thread or bits of foil from the circulation of air as bodies ambulate in the space recreates space as a site of the possible. It is in this sense that the installation of Black's work contributes to reflections on the meaning of space and placemaking within the art institution. Even though she herself speaks of art as a little fenced-off bit of civilization, the operation of her work in this new experiential context of the reopened galleries, at a moment when the nature and value of collective spaces is being re-examined and put to the test, collapses the dynamics of autonomy. The experience of such work today is anything but fenced off. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamini. What a beautiful ending. It just arrived. I wasn't quite ready. I'd like to invite the other speakers to sort of show themselves. Thank you so much, everyone. So what we're going to do now is just have a bit of a discussion between us. But please, as we're talking, everyone who's tuning in, pop your questions in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have time to come to them as well. They can be generally for everyone, or if you've got something specific for a particular speaker, then please say that in the question. But again, we might find that it pops between the speakers, depending who wants to answer it. I suppose one thing I wanted to start by picking up on is you all talked about the way in which we are navigating the space, the way, and particularly now that we have to remember how to do it and remember how to interact with objects. And we've all been navigating space, particularly at the beginning of lockdown. We were having this kind of ducking and diving, trying to stay 2 meters apart from everyone at all times. And I think that obviously kind of has become part of the learning of the way that we move through space. And even while we were doing that, I was thinking, during that period, I kept thinking of it as a kind of 60s instruction piece that, you know, Yoko Ono had written about how we had to always stay 2 meters from people. I think that was my way of sort of coping with it as a game rather than a weird reality. But the question I wanted to put to you all was, you've all touched upon that kind of fear of colliding with the work. And do you think that is a fear? Or do you think that as we're viewing this work, we have a kind of a feeling of what it might be like to collide with the work, or a feeling of what it might be like to step on it? If you see what I mean.
Well, I think Patricia in the chat used a really nice phrase: the exhibition looks beautifully and temptingly tactile, just as well it's virtual tonight. And I think that really beautifully expresses that kind of idea of slight nervousness. And for me, I think that experience felt more heightened, given that this was one of the first exhibitions I had properly engaged with in person after the lifting of restrictions. And I think it actually was one of the first exhibitions to bring in works from Europe to Scotland as well since Brexit. So it was firsts in a lot of ways. And for me, that's really exciting. And I think it's part of the daring of Karla's work that it always pushes you to a point maybe just beyond what you're immediately comfortable with. But I really liked Kamini's expression of the work recreating space as a site of the possible. Like, I think that sums up so much of what the artist is doing, and it feels to me really nice not to pin it down more than that, but that idea of possibility, it's sort of what we're all coming back to, is the possibility of what that lived encounter can be, despite our nervousness in many ways.
Thank you, Stephanie. Do either of the other of you want to chip in on that one?
I suppose, I mean, one way, I think it brings us back to the question of permission, which I think both Stephanie and Dominic pointed to, and the sort of the rules that are, the permission that Karla Black sort of talks about in relation to her own practice in relation to space, but also the kind of history of the rules of experiencing exhibitions and the rules, you know, in process-based art and things like that. And I think that's got the relation between permission and freedom, and permission and mobilities of different new kinds takes on a new sort of force and potency right now, where we're still rule bound in many ways, but those rules we know are in some way, you know, contingent and they're temporary, and there is a new I think hankering for types of you know, freedoms, and to you know, undermine the sort of sense that we have to be bound, we have to be told what to do or where to go. So I rather liked how in this space, Ruth, where you are now, where I'm virtually, there is no rule, and it's quite sort of ambulant and multi-directional the way we move, and no one's telling us which direction to go in, and that's quite nice.
Mm-hmm. And actually, that, even though it's framed as a retrospective of sorts, it's not the kind of retrospective that takes you through in a linear fashion at all, and it's not obvious which works were made before others. I think something that amazed us on taking these works out of the crate is how they might have been 10 years old, or they might have been 2 years old, but you couldn't tell. They're the sort of materials that you think would crumble over time, which they will, as you drew that out, Kamini, with, you know, materials flying together and flying apart. But they look so fresh when we got them out the crates, and I think that was an incredible thing. And I think they're such improbable things to last as well. So it's not the retrospective in that sense of, you know, this was the first work that was made, and we, you know, it's not curated in that way at all. It doesn't necessarily matter that this work was 10 years old and this work was 1 year old or made yesterday. And in a way Karla wants them to look like they did when she made them, as far as that's possible. But again, that's the sort of impossibility of her practice. Dominic, you touched upon that as well. I can't remember the phrase you used of these kind of paradoxes of her practice. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to pick up upon was that lovely anecdote that you told, Dominic, about Karla underneath the work as the director entered with visitors. And yeah. I think when we talked about it before the panel, you were kind of talking about it in terms of embarrassment as well, and the work that's in the upper gallery. We have, well, Karla's talked about it as a work that blushes. I'm kind of struck with that kind of juxtaposition of a work itself that might be blushing or embarrassed, and then the way that it was made might be embarrassing, but it shouldn't be embarrassing. You know, but it's that juxtaposition of the way in which sort of the art space is, how you exist in it as an artist, and then as a director showing people round, and that difficulty.
I've got a kind of bonkers answer to that. Thinking about blushing, because I know in some of the other bits of the chat, people have been asking about how meaning is made, and I think this is, like, in a way, the central difficulty people have in talking around Karla's work is whether there's a sense that she is withholding some kind of set of meanings or negating a set of cultural connotations that for some people would inevitably be part of the meaning of the work. The description of blushing seems to be a really interesting one, in that, you know, yes, to blush has recognized cultural meaning, but it's also completely contingent on the specific encounter that happens between the people who are witness to it or experience it. So you can blush and find that part of a public meaning around your experience. You can be unaware of it. You could find somebody else is sympathetic, ignores it, whatever. And I really like the idea that in a way the work is, Karla delegates that function to the work. What I took from her anecdote, which I must say I may have misremembered and remembered it badly, as with my memory of seeing her work for the first time, it's completely unverified. But what I take from it is that, that the expectation you would have in that situation is it's mortifying. It's an embarrassing moment that you blush at. There you are, you're kind of in supposedly kind of prestigious situation, and you're revealed as a kind of messy worker behaving badly. But in a way, I think that's what Karla's proudest of, is exactly that tension between being able to function within this space of art in a way that is licensed, but it's not, let's say it's not completely encouraged or validated, and yet to say that's the space that serves the work for her to be between wall and floor, between fixity and impermanence, and kind of an inchoate and emergent thing, and a finished and exhibitable thing. So I really like, what the reason for bringing that in was the sense that I think she's very conscious of it, and I think a lot of the things that she insists on around the work are conscious strategies that are about her right to say work about makeup is not work about work that is made of makeup is not work about femininity, for example. And I think, you know, why would we not grant the artist the right to say, I want to declare like a certain position here? I think most artists do, and hers is a difficult one, but I think it's all the more interesting for that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was really summed up well in your quote from Donna Winnicott as well, about the difficult child. And Karla does stand up for her practice, and has a really interesting relationship with talking about her practice as well, because she both sort of pushes language away, but then holds tight to particular ways of describing her work as sculpture. You know, you've all touched upon that, and as material, and not pinning down meaning in any kind of sense that connects it to particular sort of articulations in the real world, but yet it exists in the real world as well. It is what it is, rather than it's alluding to something outside itself. Yeah, I think we're going to have to turn to some of the questions actually, because we are fast moving towards 8 o'clock. So if you do have any questions coming up, then please put them in the chat. So we've got one here. Stephanie said, meaning is not imposed. I wonder if it is ever possible to impose meaning. Subtle variations exist in each individual time and place. Is this a definition of all art, and also in all communication, political, personal? So I think we're touching upon this already, but
yeah, it feels like the terrain we're kind of covering, it's sort of circling around that. And in a way, of course, that comment is completely correct. And I think, yes, I mean, in all of our encounters with art, of course, there's never a direct imposition of meaning. There's always space for you to bring your own interpretation to a work. But I think what strikes me with Karla Black's practice is that space for the viewer is particularly generous. And I think when you look at her published writings or talks or interviews, she is remarkably consistent about that insistence that the viewer is with the work in the space, and at a point where it's given over to the exhibition space, she removes herself and is replaced by the viewer. And I think that's quite interesting, that generosity of that gesture. And for me, that's very much tied up with the idea of not imposing meaning and allowing us some space to bring our own reactions and motivations to the work, which is why, exactly as Dominic says, we can't help but, you know, insist or bring our cultural connotations or associations of the material. It very clearly states that it's Gaviscon. We didn't necessarily need to know that, but we are given that information front and center. So all of these points, I think, are crucial to that sort of the complexity of the artist's position. And in a way, it sort of brings me to what Ian asked in the questions, which was, do we recognize a vocabulary of suggested forms or symbols or shapes? I think I see them very much as a kind of vocabulary of geometry, the repetition of circles and squares or lozenges and rectangles. And it might only be the distortion of the individual materials that breaks that rigidity of the geometry, but the vocabulary is maybe there in the sort of textual implications of the materials themselves, I would say. But it's interesting how all these points kind of come together in a way which is maybe part of the cohesiveness of the artist's practice.
It's interesting to think about that cohesiveness in terms of something that exceeds the discourse, both of, you know, the artist's own statement and, you know, as well as the kind of the discourses of art's histories that we've all been talking about, and as well as the excess of the works to their titles, and the way she talks about the titles actually being important, and you know, she keeps referring to containment and almost a stopping point, you know, for the materials beneath them, sort of stopping point or something to prevent it from seeming, I can't remember her exact words, but totally chaotic, or a sense of arbitrariness to the material. So there's that collation of sense or reintegration of sense, but it seems like you know, it's retroactive. It's an afterthought in some ways. And what's more important or more sort of urgent is that becoming, by which actually, as you said, Stephanie, you know, artists as subject and us as subjects, and the people outside the gallery as subjects. And, you know, there's a sense of a kind of collective space that is really not this beyond the control or the permission given to us by her or the curator or anyone else. And I think that's what makes it so topical. Actually, you know, that's what we're talking about, the topicality of it, really, I think.
We've got a question from Fiona coming in here. I'm interested in what Kamini said about messiness being contained to the point, about messiness being contained to the point of being decorative. Could the panel speak to the idea of the decorative in Karla's work?
It's such a loaded word, isn't it? Because you know, I don't apologize, Fiona. I think it's really interesting because I think I remember something where Karla mentioned someone like Richard Tuttle and how his work, although it uses a very similar color palette, has a similar kind of, let's say, soft materiality as opposed to a hardness of, you know, something like steel or glass or metal. How his work was never described in terms of femininity, even though conventionally you could equally apply that. And I think the decorative has that kind of uneasy categorization as well. But I think there's nothing wrong with the decorative. It's more our uneasiness because we're all trained as art historians to somehow separate that off from what we deal with, and this kind of compartmentalization that we're still all so obsessed with. I think that idea of the decorative certainly is there for me, and particularly with the use of the gold and copper leaf and these materials that, you know, historically sit within a decorative arts tradition. I think Karla is very clearly drawing on those, and as much as she is with the Vaseline or the makeup, contaminating our sense of what is a material for sculpture. So for me, decorative is about the subversion as well. But I don't know what the other panelists would say.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that the tension between the decorative and the symbolic, and how I think, you know, the decorative in her work, you know, tries to resist symbolic over determination, whether that's gendered or in respect to histories of art and design and craft and all, you know, any symbolic territory. So I think actually the question of the decorative pertains to something we've all been talking about, to do with repetition and control, and something to do with relation of detail and whole, and but something very precise to do with permission and rule, and how that inscribes itself on objects, on surfaces and things, to the point of containing messiness, to stop it being, you know, to retain it back onto the object surface, I think.
I've got maybe like two things on that as well, if it's useful. One is just, of course, like the idea of being decorative was one of the absolute kind of fears of that generation of abstract painters whose work really tarried with being elegant wall-sized decoration, and its relationship or potential subservience to the wall was one of the things it kind of fought against. And I like the idea in Stephanie's sense of decor as a kind of contagion between these categories, but also as a way of holding and claiming space. You think of, like, you know, patterned wallpaper and so on that can do that. But also decor is not defined spatially between wall and floor. It moves across the spaces, especially of domestic interiors. I think that's maybe relevant. But I also had in mind something which I'm very indebted to Mason Leveryap for, because she brought it up in a conversation she had with Jimmy Robert. And it's a quote from the poet Frank O'Hara, who was also a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. And I always think of that somehow. And he says, to be alert is to be decorative. And I really like the ambiguity in that statement about the relationships between these things. But I think Karla's work itself exactly is kind of alert to its own material contingency, to the point where it could be decorative, but not in the pejorative sense. I think it's that O'Hara's sense of the poet of being alert and also decorating in some way the world with words that resonates. And I love the idea of him as somebody in a museum thinking about alertness in that particular spatial configuration, and somehow that influencing this insight he has. So that was just what occurred to me.
It definitely made me think about the work that's behind me, the mirror work, because a mirror of that kind is so domestic, and it sort of strikes me in relation to what you were saying there about wallpaper, Dominic, and a kind of domestic interior with, you know, that might have that kind of mirror on it. But that work it's a mirror on which is painted on, so you also view it possibly as a decorative surface, but also one that imposes itself upon you. So that it's a painting in which there is space, but a space that you occupy. And I mean, I'm not making a particular point there, but I think it definitely made me kind of think of that work, that question. We're really running close to the end, but there's a really fascinating question that's just come in from Jackie Donachie, who's one of the artists who's shown here, which I'd quite like to put to everyone. She's written, I'm fascinated by the relationship between performance, space and Karla's work, particularly with artists from the 60s that we mentioned in the presentations. In these, directions seem to be very important in the work, the performance of making and also the physical interaction that's suggested by objects like Robert Morris's objects. How has instruction informed Karla Black's practice, either in direction of viewers or materials, and how much is left to the random?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it's something that probably the answer to that requires you to know her sort of working practice quite intimately. But I wonder if it's something that you can sense when you're actually viewing her work.
I think Jackie should ask Karla that question.
What's that? Sorry, Dominic.
I think Jackie should ask Karla that question.
I think so, yes. And on which note, I should say that we do have an artist talk coming up on the 23rd of September, so that might be a question that we can bring to that.
I do think we can see the traces of the instructions or of the methodology, and I think the artist is very open about that. So the kind of the way that the process is laid bare for us in the finished object, I think, is really lovely, and her insistence on prioritizing the mark or the gesture, I think, leads us back to that kind of sense of the instructional quality and the idea that there were various steps to take and there were various processes to kind of unfold. And I do think for me that sort of underscores the kind of temporality of making that we've all thought about and talked about in relation to the kind of the legacy of the sort of 60s process art that, you know, speaks so beautifully to Karla's practice. So, you know, for me, it's something that you can kind of go backwards in time and trace that process, which there's something really revelatory about that.
I think we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I just want to really thank Stephanie and Dominic and Kamini for joining us and speaking so beautifully about Karla Black's work. I've written hundreds of notes. I'm really there were so many sort of exciting points made, and we really haven't had time to touch on all of them. But I wanted to end on the way in which I put this invitation to you was sort of closed and open at the same time. I was quite specific about the word space, but I think that you've all responded so differently. And I love, Stephanie, that you were talking about how Karla's work makes space for the viewer, and the way in which the word space is metaphorical as well as physical, I think is something that comes together in Karla's work. And all of your talks have drawn that out in different ways. You've talked about the physicality of the encounter in this exhibition, but then also of the space that it creates in that more metaphorical sense. So thank you for doing that. And I hope people who've joined us on Zoom, I hope that if you haven't seen the exhibition already, you're tempted to do so. And if you have seen it, you're tempted to come back again. It's on until the 24th of October. Yeah. So please do come back, or come if you haven't done already. Thank you everyone for joining us.